So now we're going to get on to assembling the rest of the gun, which isn't really that difficult, but I do get a lot of questions about it. So the first thing that you're going to want to do is put your striker or hammer back into the tube. And you know, some people put a little bit of grease in the tube and on the hammer. I prefer to use oil. So you put your striker pin in. Once you get your hammer lined up in the back of the tube, put your striker pin in, slide it forward. And then the next thing you're going to want to do is start installing your breech. Now, the best way to do that is to take your barrel, turn it so that the inlet, the air inlet or port, lines up with the port on the breech. And what I usually do at that point is I just turn this over by the barrel so it stays aligned and set it down. You're going to want to get your screw, your center screw or inner breech screw as I often call it, ready to go. I usually put it right on the end of the wrench. These often need to be replaced when you're putting the gun back together. Usually the threads get messed up on the screw itself. And if those threads are fine, very often the hex socket on the screw is rounded out a little bit. That tends to happen when they tighten them at the factory. These are the combination of being a very small socket and not being a very not being a very hard steel is a bad combination. They really do round out pretty easy. I sell custom screws to replace these, and the custom screws that I sell make it a lot easier to install the breech and tighten it down snug against the tube without going through a lot of extra work. But what I'm going to do is we've got our screw ready to go. We want to take our bolt, and there's something I want to point out here that a lot of people don't realize. With custom bolts, especially the ones that I make, this is not an issue. But with Crosman bolts and bolts especially made by other people, one of the huge problems is that if the hole for this handle is not drilled perfectly center on the bolt will tend to bind in the breech. You don't see this too often with Crosman bolts. Sometimes I run into it. It's usually with aftermarket bolts, people that have questionable machining skills or equipment. But what will happen is the bolt won't want to slide back and forth easily. In those cases, usually if you unthread the handle and spin the bolt over and thread it in from the other side of that hole, not all the time, but very often, it'll work a lot smoother. Now in this particular one, it didn't make any difference. It works just as smooth from either side. So that means that that hole is pretty well centered. What we're going to do here on the installation of this is we're going to put our bolt in. And I'm just going to use the hex wrench to push it in a little further. And I'm not going to close it all the way. I'm just going to push it forward far enough that I can comfortably, well, you want to put your gasket in this hole. You want to take your transfer sleeve, and I suggest checking, nope, hey, it didn't go on the floor, that's good. I suggest checking and making sure that the transfer sleeve is clean, that it doesn't have a burr around either edge that would restrict airflow at all. And as long as it looks good, you can place that on there. Now with that sitting the way it is, you're going to want to make sure your striker pin is back, not all the way into the screw hole, but just in front of it. And your bolt just far forward enough that the O-ring is still showing a little bit. And you're going to want to make sure your barrel port is lined up with the hole in the breech. Usually you can hold the barrel itself as you spin this over and it'll stay. And then what you want to do, I'm going to drop down here a little, is you want to insert the striker pin into the slot in the breech, and your transfer sleeve should fit right into that port on your barrel. Now, one thing that I want to point out is that you've got you've got a top and bottom to that transfer sleeve in there. The smaller diameter end goes inside. I'll show you that. The smaller diameter end, which is probably very difficult to see, goes inside of your rubber gasket. There's a thicker, taller side, which inserts into your barrel port when it's sitting inside the breech. It looks like that. So make sure you put it in the right way. And like I said, if you get down to eye level with it, it's usually not that difficult to get everything to line up. You can actually see the sleeve going right into the barrel. Usually it kind of snaps in. Now, at that point, you want to hold the breech against the tube, and you're going to want to pull your bolt back far enough that it exposes the hole for the center breech screw. Now, I let my screw fall off the end of my wrench, so I got to put that back on there to get that screw to start to thread in. Now, the way that I tighten it down for the final tightening is I have relatively strong hands. I just grip the breech and literally squeeze it together with the tube by hand. Some people prefer to use a squeeze clamp or put it in a vise and gently tighten them together with the back side of the breech sticking out far enough that you can reach the screw. I just use my hand. And as you tighten the screw down, you'll feel the breech seating against the tube nice and snug. Now, you can't tighten these screws down very much. I suggest just using the short end to grab and putting the long end into the screw. That way you can't get enough leverage to do too much damage. And just turn it until it's snug and the wrench starts to twist just a tiny bit. That's as tight as you're going to get the original breech screw. Any tighter than that, you're either going to round out the socket of the screw, or you might even strip out the threads on the screw itself or in the tube. With these, usually it's the screw that the threads strip on before the tube does. But that's pretty snug. You can barely move or wobble that at all. You don't want to put your set screw in and snug it down yet. You want to get your rear breech screw in first. And before you do that, you have to put the rest of your striker assembly together. So the first thing you're going to want to do is take your hammer spring, or striker spring, as it's also called, and you insert it into the hole that's in the back of the striker. And then you take your end cap, or tube plug, I've heard it referred to both ways, and you slide that in, making sure that the spring goes inside the end cap. You line up your hole with the hole for the rear breech screw, and at this point you want to take your breech plug and put that in the back of the breech, making sure that the hole is oriented up and down. And then you want to take your rear breech screw, it should be 3/4 of an inch long, get it lined up, and you don't want to tighten it down all the way quite yet. Leave it just a little bit loose. You're going to notice that the end plug will push in and out a little bit. And if you look at the bottom of the tube, you'll be able to see how well the screw hole lines up with the tube. Sometimes, if you push the plug all the way in and tighten it, the hole won't quite line up. Or if you let it relax all the way, sometimes the hole won't line up. There's variances in the way that Crosman makes their parts, and that's what causes them to align or not align. So what you want to do is make sure that you've got the screw hole in your end plug centered in the hole in the tube pretty well before you tighten this top screw down. And you don't have to tighten it that much. Nice and snug, but don't torque it. It doesn't need to be torqued. If you're worried about it coming loose, you can add a little bit of thread locker to the tip of it before you thread it in. It comes from the factory with what they call a nylon patch. It's the blue color on the tip. That helps to lock it in there a little bit. It will loosen over time. And just like with firearms, with air guns, you have to go back and check your screws once in a while and make sure they're snug. Every once in a while, shoot or degas, shoot all the air out of the gun or degas it, and check your valve screws, make sure they're snug. Every once in a while, check your rear breech screw. The inner breech screw, very difficult to get to on this model, so unless you take your gun apart on a regular basis, I wouldn't worry about that one too much. As long as your rear breech screw is tight and you've got a barrel band on here, it'll stay together. With the Crosman screw, I do suggest actually, every couple of years, tear your gun apart, clean it, rebuild it. You don't necessarily have to take the pressure tube assembly apart, but it's a good idea in general just to take it apart and clean it. With the custom screws that I have, the Torx Drive inner breech screw, you get that snug down pretty good. They tend to stay in place. And you can also use thread locker on these screws if you really are concerned about them coming loose. The inner breech screw. Just use a very, very tiny amount. You don't want the thread locker to end up inside the tube because then it's going to gum up your striker and it's going to tend to stick. And believe it or not, even with oil or grease in there, sometimes thread locker will adhere to the inside of the tube and cause a sticking spot. I've had it happen with bolts. I've had it happen with strikers. I've seen it from guns that customers have shipped me full of thread locker everywhere. So that's how you get your breech on. Now the next thing that you're going to want to do is install your set screw for the barrel. Now one of the things that you're going to notice is that when you put your handle in, if you don't tighten down the set screw on the breech enough, it allows the barrel to sit up near the top of the hole inside the breech. And when you try to push your bolt forward, sometimes they won't push in. Now in this particular gun, not a problem. Even with the bolt loose, or even with the screw loose, the bolt slides forward. So tightening it down, still works the same. Sometimes you'll notice that they don't, because there's variances once again in machining from one barrel to the next, where sometimes the bolts are a little tighter fit, and if that screw's not tight enough, the bolt will not slide forward into the back of the barrel. There's an O-ring on this bolt, and it seals inside the back of the barrel in what they call the lead. So you just want to make sure that it works smooth. And the same thing with your inner breech screw or center breech screw. You just want to tighten that down snug so that it's compressing the barrel down against the bottom of the breech. It doesn't need to be torqued down. There's not a lot of metal there for it to thread into. If you over tighten it, it'll just strip out your breech. So now your breech is installed. The next thing to do is properly install the handle. I usually clean the threads on the bolt because they put thread locker on these from the factory. This one looks pretty clean. In this particular one, the threads are actually damaged because they over-tightened it at the factory. But you only need a very, very tiny amount of thread locker. Just enough to barely coat all the way around. So you make sure that your hole is somewhat centered in this channel so that you can get your handle in there without getting thread locker all over the place. And usually they thread in pretty smooth. Sometimes they fight you a little bit. Now with this, I usually just grab it with a cloth and give it a little snug by hand. You don't have to tighten it with a wrench. The thread locker will do its job. And if you tighten it with a wrench, all you're going to do is round over the threads on the handle, like this one came from Crosman rounded over. But that's all you need, and within 10 or 15 minutes, that thread locker will be set. It'll be strong. Your handle's not going to loosen on you. And that's the completion of breech installation. Okay, so the next step, if you're going to put your original sights back on, would be to put the rear sight sleeve back onto the barrel. I usually skip this part and just go right to the barrel band because I tend to just use scopes and red dot sights on my guns, and prefer to just keep them a little more simple, a little lighter weight, keep things stripped off that I don't need. But if you're going to install it, before you put your barrel bands on, you need to put your rear sight sleeve on. Now there's a flat on the top of the barrel that your set screw needs to seat in. And the rear sight gives you the option of mounting. If you take this sleeve off and you hold it just slightly back from the front, you'll see that all three of these holes sit over the recess, the flat recess on the top of the barrel. So that allows clearance for the screws to go through the sleeve just far enough for the threads to catch well. Now, when you mount the sight blade, you're going to have the option of putting it slightly further forward, which would be the middle hole, or all the way back, which would be the further back hole. The front hole is for the set screw that holds the sleeve on, which requires the 1/16 inch hex wrench. And you want to try to line the sleeve up so that it sits the way it's supposed to, with the set screw sticking straight up. It's easy to get it cocked at a little bit of an angle, and then when you tighten the screw, it'll dig in and keep it at an angle. So it's good to make sure that it's relatively straight. And the easiest way to do that is you leave your wrench in and you hold the gun upright and you get a pretty good idea of whether it's straight up and down or not. Snug that down good. And now you can reinstall your rear sight blade using the original slotted screw. Now you've got two slotted screws. One of them holds the sight blade to your rear sight sleeve. The other one, the smaller one, holds your front sight, fiber optic sight, to the mount, just in case you get them mixed up. And while we're here, to adjust your rear sight, this front screw just holds it down. Your elevation is adjusted with a set screw that's in front of the fiber optic sight to either raise or lower your fiber optic. And then in the middle of the fiber optic sight, which is horseshoe shaped, you've got a set screw. If you loosen that, it allows you to slide to adjust for windage. I'm just going to hold it in the middle because this gun wasn't sighted in to begin with. Okay, so now that you've got your rear sight installed, we're going to move on to your barrel band. Just make sure that your screws are loosened up enough that they don't go into the space for the barrel and the tube. That way you won't scratch or gouge up your tube and your barrel. I don't know that there is a right or wrong way to put this on. There's two little dimples on what I consider to be the backside. And the only reason why I tend to put them on that way is because they tend to not drill the holes perfectly centered. The top hole tends to be a little bit to the left if those dimples are on the back. But like I said, it doesn't necessarily make a huge difference. Just that if it was on that way to begin with, it's going to tend to twist your barrel either to the left or the right a little bit from its orientation with the tube if you put it on the opposite way of the way that it was. So what I generally do is I just kind of take a look at where the dimple on the barrel is and where the screw sits on the barrel band, and if it looks like it was originally tightened down the other way, then that's what I tend to do, is put it on the other way. And that's exactly the case on this one. It was off probably about a 32nd of an inch to the left when I put it on the other way. So this is originally the way that it went on. So, and it seems to fit more naturally that way. The barrel's going right down the middle of the tube. Barrel band looks like it wants to keep it there. So just something to keep in mind, especially if you already had a scope or sights on this that were sighted in. If you put the barrel band on the other way and it moves your barrel one way or the other, it's going to throw off your zero on your scope or your sights. So I tend to keep it the same way that it came off. If it's, if you're putting it together a new gun, it doesn't really matter whichever way it fits best. But if you're putting a gun back together, try to get the barrel band on the same way that it was. Now generally what I do is I take the screw out, and that way I can look and see the dimple and make sure that I'm actually lined up with it. And then I put the screw back in. And once it starts to get snug, you can actually feel the screw seating into the dimple. It doesn't want to move forward or backward. And it just snug it up a little bit. And then I do the same thing with the bottom. And I know to a lot of you, you're going to think I'm being a little bit too anal about this. But like I said, it makes a difference if you're already zeroed in with your sights or your scope. It makes a difference that you get everything back together the same way that it was. The barrel band probably makes a bigger difference than most other parts will. So I make sure I'm in the original dimple that the screw created when it was installed at the factory. And then this is the same thing as the other screws in this gun. You don't want to torque them down. You just want them nice and snug. If you're worried about them coming loose, use thread locker. I've never seen a barrel band just come loose. So that's that. So you have your basic tube and breech assembly together, your barrel band in place. Now what a lot of people like to do is they like to add a second barrel band to just stiffen this up a little, because as you can see, there's a little bit of flex to the front of that barrel. I can lift it away from the tube, I can push it down, I can push it side to side. I like to give that a little bit better support. So I suggest getting a second barrel band and mounting it closer, maybe 3/4 of an inch or an inch back from the front of the tube is a good location for that second barrel band. If you're going to use your original sight mount, you're going to want to make sure that the barrel band is back far enough that it doesn't interfere with your sight mount sliding on all the way. What some people like to do is slide the sight mount back all the way and tighten that first, and then slide your barrel band forward until it touches the sight mount, and then tighten it down that way. It's a good method of doing it. I don't usually use the original sight mounts, so I usually just put them I put it so that the set screw is centered about 1 full inch back, and that way you're missing the threaded section of the tube and the transition to where the tube is smooth. You're missing all of that if you go back a full inch and tightening your set screw down into metal that's its full thickness there. So now that the barrel band is installed, we're going to install the front sight mount and the fiber optic sight. So the front sight mount is contoured on the bottom so that it fits over the top of your fill cap and tube. And it slips right over the front of the barrel. You want to push it all the way back. And just like the rear sight mount, you're going to want to make sure that it's straight up and down when you tighten the screw. Now the easiest way to do it with the front mount is to simply squeeze it against the fill cap. And this forces the contour against the cap so that when you tighten your screw, it's now straight. If you've got a front barrel band that's tightened down already, you won't be able to compress the front of the barrel down like that. But you can slide that barrel band back, then push it down, and then put your barrel band back forward again. I didn't add a forward barrel band to this. So now what you're going to want to do is align the hole in your sight blade with the hole that is further back. And I'm using the 1/8 slotted screwdriver for this. They make the slot in these screws very, very narrow, and it's actually kind of difficult to find a precision screwdriver that isn't too small or too big to fit in that. The 1/8 that I have seems to be just about perfect. It's not quite wide enough, but relatively good fit. Once again, you don't have to torque that screw down very much, just snug. So now your sights are mounted, and the only thing left to do is put on your trigger group and your stock. So I'm going to show you how to put the trigger group together. You have 3 pins. One goes in the middle position of these 3 holes. One goes in the top position, and one goes back here for the trigger. Then you're going to want to take the compression spring, which is the trigger return spring, and install that into this little slot right there. You're going to want to take your trigger, lean it forward just a little bit so that that stud sits in front of that spring while you catch the pin in the hole. Get it down all the way so that when you pull the trigger back, it compresses that compression spring. You want to take your transfer link, drop that over your middle pin, and you want to take your sear and drop that over the top pin. Now people ask me all the time what to lubricate these parts with. I tend to use, for these trigger groups, just regular good old-fashioned bearing grease, and I'd put a very tiny amount just at the contact points on the pins. I tend to use oil for the hammers or the striker, whatever you want to call it, and so I would oil the top and back surface of the sear rather than use grease. But I also put a little bit of grease where the compression spring sits in that channel before I put it all together. I'm not using grease at the moment just because it's going to make the video a lot messier. So the next thing you're going to want to do is put your sear spring, which also rests against the safety so that when you slide the safety back and forth, it holds the safety in its position. So you're gonna put the hook that's on the end of that underneath the edge of the sear, and you're gonna line the pin of the trigger with the center of that hole. Now you're going to want to twist it just a little bit so that it sits across the middle of the hole where the safety fits. And this will allow you to get the cover on without hitting this little outcrop here. And usually if you place it on there lightly, just give it a little wiggle, and it'll seat right in where it belongs. And then the next step, while you're holding it together firmly, now being plastic, you don't want to cut new threads when you put the screw in. So once again, I tell you to turn the screw counterclockwise with a little pressure on it until you feel it drop into the threads. And that way, instead of cutting new threads and cross-threading, you'll be threading it into the original threads. With plastic, it's very, very easy to cross-thread, and you won't even realize you're doing it until the screw just keeps turning and doesn't tighten. A standard 1/8 screwdriver, rather than the precision version, works really, really well for these screws. But like I said, they have a very shallow slot, and sometimes that makes it a little difficult. And the screw is actually going in at a little bit of an angle here, so I'm going to correct that. It may have just been that way from the factory. And yeah, apparently that's just the way they threaded in at the factory, because it doesn't want to go straight. It's straightening out a little bit as I tighten it. So, yep. That shallow slot makes it a little tricky to keep that screwdriver in there. And I'm trying not to round over the edges of the slot or mark the screw up. And you just turn it until it stops. Maybe just a tiny, tiny bit snug. If you try to tighten it until the screw stops turning, it's relatively easy to just strip the threads out in your plastic casing. This one has a little deeper slot in it. Oops. So it's not quite as hard. And I'm also using my finger as a guide to keep the screwdriver in place. And there's your trigger casing. All right. Now the safety we don't put back on yet, because you won't be able to get the stock on the gun if the safety is on the trigger group. So the next step is you take your trigger group and you line up your front and rear holes with your hole in the tube for the stock lug and for the rear trigger screw. Take your stock lug and get that started. Just turn it finger tight to start with. It has a nylon patch on the threads, like most of the screws, so sometimes it's a little difficult to thread in with just your fingers. And I like to use my S2 driver to put your rear trigger frame screw in, and as you'll probably notice, I backed the screw up counterclockwise. You can actually hear it click in and then go forward clockwise. And that's just to make sure that it lines up. And the reason why I tend to do this, especially with the screws that Crosman provides, is because the tip of that screw has a taper to it. The threads are smaller diameter at the tip for the first couple of full threads. It's very, very easy to cross thread these, and they're made out of a relatively soft steel. So I like to make sure, if I'm reusing or even if I'm replacing with a new one, that it's lined up with the threads, not cross-threading when I'm installing it. Now, with this screw, you want to turn it till it stops, and then you just want to give it maybe 1/8 of a turn, because this is plastic and it's going to compress as you tighten the screw down. And if you over tighten it, you're just going to pull the screw down too far into your end cap and over compress your plastic. Never seen one crack. I've seen them compress quite a bit. But if you are using a power adjuster on the back, the screw will actually go too far in and hit the threads on your power adjuster. They'll hit the threads on the adjustable spring guide that's in there. You don't have to worry about it so much with this. You just don't want to over tighten it because you don't want to mess up your plastic trigger frame. On the stock lug, I'm just going to take a 7/16 socket driver and do the same thing. I turn it until it stops, and then I'm going to give it about 1/8 of a turn. And that's all you need to do. Like I said before, if you're worried about something coming loose, you have no plans of ever taking the gun apart again, use some thread locker on the tip of the screws, just a tiny little bit. Torquing them down isn't really gonna accomplish much of anything other than mess up your parts. So like I said, you don't put your safety in yet. What you do now is you take your stock and you set it down. Okay, and what we're going to notice here is that the pressure gauge doesn't line up with the hole in the stock. And that's because it can move side to side. So you just get it more centered. And then you drop your stock on. And if you're worried about the way it looks, you can realign that to the center of the hole in the stock. Moves pretty freely when there's no pressure in the tube. Now I left the original screw in the stock when I had taken it off, but it's your P3 Phillips drive. So your next step, same thing. I drive people nuts because I always start off by turning the screw backwards until I feel the thread click in, and then I turn it the right way. So I'm laughing because my father-in-law, Bob, loves to yell at me when he sees me turning the screw the wrong way. "You're turning it the wrong way!" Like, I know, Bob. Just making sure I got the threads lined up. And this is the same thing. You turn it until it stops and maybe just snug it down slightly. But there's not a lot of give. And not only will you pull the screw down through the wood a little bit, because these are hard wood, but they're not super hard wood. But as you're tightening that screw, you're also turning the stock lug on the other side once you get it tight to a certain point. And you don't want to over tighten your stock lug. It could strip out the threads in your tube, and it can over compress the front of the trigger group. So that's all you need to do. Now the last piece, you're going to need your pick again, and you're going to want to insert it into this side hole on the same side that your bolt handle is on. There's a little wire spring in there, the one that holds the safety in place. You pull that forward, and from the opposite side you insert the smaller diameter end of your safety into the hole, and you're just going to try to get it behind that wire. And then you take your pick out and you put it to the front. Now you're going to go behind the trigger and grab that same wire, which is now being held forward by the safety. Pull it forward just a little, wiggle your safety until it comes out the other side, and then you release that spring. Now your safety will slide back and forth and snap comfortably and smoothly from safe to fire. And that is the completed reassembly of the Discovery rifle.